Welcome and settle in. Let your shoulders drop and your breathing soften. Tonight, you and I are going to spend a day in the life of a single keel grain, a tiny quiet world in the gentle darkness beneath our feet. Imagine yourself drifting down into the restful hush below the grass and fallen leaves, where the air is still and cool, and where the small things of the earth go about their slow, patient routines. If you enjoy this soft, sleepy journey, you can like this video and subscribe so you can return here whenever you need to unwind. And you can use the playlist link in the description to keep learning while you drift. What city country are you watching from right now? Imagine yourself shrinking gently and calmly until a hand's breadth becomes a landscape, and a raindrop becomes a small lake, and a grain of seal becomes your home. You find yourself resting against a surface that is smooth in places and softly pitted in others, like stuff that remembers ancient rivers. The world around you is dim and muted, and little shafts of light wander down through cracks between fragments like quiet sunbeams in a library. The air holds the tender scent of damp earth, a mild, comforting note that feels like a blanket pulled over your shoulders. Take a breath in your mind's eye as if you could inhale the slow rhythm of the soil and let it lull you. The soil grain is a humble companion. It has no hurry and it has no demands. It is a shard of a rock that weathered over long ages, or a particle shaped by rivers and dust storms that were all gentle in their own time. It might be quartz, light and pale, with a sturdy clarity that catches faint glimmers. It might be feldspar, softly altering as it rests, becoming clays that layer like pages. It might be a clay particle itself, thin and delicate, a sheet folded into tiny stacks with small spaces where water hides and ions gather like quiet guests. It might hold a whisper of iron that gives it a warm tone, or a hint of organic matter that made its way into the pores and stayed. The grain is small enough to hold in a pinched fingertip, but here, in this dreamlike scale, you can walk around it as if it were a gentle hill. Around you, there are other grains, each with their own shapes. Some are rounded, polished by the soft embrace of water and time. Others have edges that catch on your attention like a page corner. They gather into clusters, natural little neighborhoods bound by threads of organic glue and the subtle touch of minerals. Soil is not just a pile of particles. It is an assembly, a constellation of pieces held together by delicate forces that hardly make a sound. The spaces between these grains are as important as the grains themselves. Those spaces are pores, small and smaller, filled sometimes with air and sometimes with water, and often with a delicate film of both. In these pores, the world of soil breathes. Imagine the initial moments before dawn. The upper soil rests in a mild coolness that lingers from the night. A faint dampness holds, gathered from the evening. The pressure of the air is gentle, and the ground seems to hum at a frequency below hearing, simply by existing. The soil grain cradles a few molecules of water that cling to its surface. They do not splash or surge. They sit and hold, drawn into place by quiet attractions, a whisper of a bond. Some ions drift in that film, calcium, magnesium, potassium, like quiet travelers who know the way, Some are held loosely on the surface of the grain, and others glide off when a stronger attraction calls them. Around them, simpler molecules float in the thin air of the pore. Oxygen diffuses inward, curious and unhurried. Carbon dioxide wanders outward, not banished, but gently escorted. This is respiration, the soil's simple breath. You find yourself leaning into the surface of the grain. If you rest your mind on it, you can almost sense the arrangement within, in patterns, repeating motifs that extend through the particle like a chorus, sung softly again and again. Silica, tetrahedra, and aluminum octahedra. In the case of clay, or a sturdy lattice of silicon and oxygen in quartz, or more elaborate structures that carry a faint memory of the mountain they came from. It is the quietest kind of architecture, not built by hands but by conditions and time. The grain does not announce any of this. It simply holds what it is. The day begins. On the surface above, a pale light spreads behind the leaves, and a bird stirs in a branch. Down here, there is no bright sunrise. There is a slow easing into a slightly warmer palette, a barely noticeable shift that you feel more than see. Dew collects in the tiny windows of the soil, beads forming and merging with soft, rounded edges. If you trace the edge of a pore, you find the thin meniscus of water clinging wherever it can. Capillary forces, quiet and strong, carry water into slender throats and into narrower spaces until the tension is balanced. The grain waits, neither resisting nor urging, simply letting water settle where it fits. Somewhere nearby, a root hair leans closer, the thinnest extension of a plant's searching self. Its tip is soft, guided by chemistry, by the presence of moisture, and by the faint signature of nutrients that the plant needs. It releases a touch of mucilage, a gentle gel that turns the space near the grain into a place of communion. Sugars exude as a kind of polite invitation, a silent sharing of energy that draws in microorganisms. Bacteria gather, not hastily, but like visitors to a tea table, arriving one by one until there is a quiet conversation taking place. They attach along the surface of the grain and to each other, forming films that are thin and pliable, like transparent tapestries draped across this mineral hill. If you stretch out your senses, you can almost hear the faintest tremor of a fungal hypha gliding by, a slender thread, gossamer and patient. It passes across pores that would be difficult to traverse, bridging like a footbridge made of silk. It releases enzymes, subtle keys that unlock the proteins and sugars in fragments of leaf and wood. These actions are not dramatic. They are more like the slow breathing of a sleeping village, each resident doing a very small piece of work at a pace that respects the night. Bits of organic matter rest in nearby spaces, crumbs and flakes that settled from the surface, each carrying a story of sunlight captured and then gently offered back to the soil. The grain is part of that story, a stable seat where these processes pause and persist. Here, in the quiet, decomposition is not a collapse. It is a soft rearrangement. Carbon changes partners. Nitrogen returns to forms that can travel again. Phosphorus, so often shy and easily entwined with minerals, waits near certain edges where a proton or a slight shift in pH can draw it out or hold it close. The grain feels these small changes as the subtlest tug, the mildest touch. The soil's chemistry is a garden of balances, all moving gently toward stability and then toward a new balance when something changes. A little more moisture, a little less air, a hint more acidity from a root's breath. The grain does not mind. It is an anchor and a neighbor. Imagine moving slowly along the grain's surface. You find micro pits formed long ago. Perhaps a feldspar surface gave one of its ions to the water film and in exchange took on a slight new shape. Perhaps a clay plate parted from its neighbor, a minor shift that leaves space between the sheets where water is happiest to lie still. These changes are simple and small, more like a yawn than a transformation, even though they are the foundation of fertility. They allow the soil to hold nutrients gently and then offer them when needed, like a careful hand that never grips too tightly. The grain's charge, if it is a clay, is a soft pull on cations, a way of noticing them and keeping them nearby, without insisting that they stay when the root calls for them. This is cation exchange, the quiet commerce of the underground world. As the sun rises above, gentle warmth reaches downward. The tiny air spaces between grains slowly become kinder to oxygen, which moves in more freely. Carbon dioxide, the breath of microbes and roots, is carried outward along pressure gradients that are more like slopes than cliffs. Water senses the pull from the air above, and some of it evaporates slowly, retreating along the curves of the pore spaces. Each small movement causes a rebalancing of tension. Minutiae draw closer to the surface, pulling softly on grains and on the films that connect them. The soil grain does not move much, but it feels the delicate tugs as if the day is stretching. A springtail may pass nearby, stepping carefully across the boundaries between particles like a thoughtful traveler on stepping stones. Its interest is in bits of fungal hyphae and decaying plant matter, but its presence makes a small breeze in this tiny realm. A mite explores a cavity, leaving behind a narrow trail that catches a few specks of humus. A nematode swims slowly in a film of water, turning now and then with a graceful curve, not so much hunting as participating, part of the gentle circulation of energy. If you listen with your imagination, you can almost hear a faint creak as an earthworm, somewhere several grains away, makes its steady way through a channel it built one quiet night. The channel opens a highway for air and water, and for roots that will find it later, and the grain is content to be one of many that line its walls. When rain falls, the soil changes its music. Even a gentle rain, the kind that looks like mist at a distance, sends beads into the pores. Some pores fill one ledge at a time. Air dissolves into the incoming water or slips away through nearby spaces. The water carries tiny fragments of organic matter, thin as tea, flowing along micro cracks and into smaller pockets. Some of that organic matter settles onto the surface of the grain and behaves like a mild glue, helping grains hold hands, building an aggregate that shelters all sorts of quiet lives. Calcium and other cations gather at the meeting places, holding the aggregate as a polite host. The structure resists collapse even when the rain becomes steady, because the architecture of pores and bonds and threads is tuned to allow water to come in and then to leave, carrying instructions, carrying gentle gifts. The soil grain belongs to a horizon in the profile of the ground. Above, a layer of leaves and twigs slowly turns into darker crumbs of organic matter, the O horizon, like a blanket that holds the night's dew. Beneath that, the A horizon, where this grain might rest, is mixed and lively, where roots reach and microbes find their food. Below it, an E horizon may be pale from leaching, and still lower, a B horizon gathers the washed colors of iron and clay, deeper tones that hold rains past. Deeper still, the C horizon remembers the weathered bedrock. Together, these layers are the soil's quiet chapters. A single day only moves you through the first sentences of one of them, but the grain keeps its place, contributing to the whole by simply being present. Mid-morning warmth arrives. The plant overhead begins to pull a little harder, sending up water through xylem tubes with a persistent, steady draw. That pull reaches down to where you rest, and the water film thins ever so slightly. As it thins, the capillary forces tighten their grip along the curves and corners, and small bridges of water between grains open and close like eyelids that never fully shut. When the film thins, oxygen moves in more easily, and zones that were quietly short on air feel refreshed. In those refreshed corridors, bacteria that prefer a little more oxygen begin to process ammonia into nitrite and then into nitrate, a slow cascade called nitrification. They do it without fuss, and the grained surface simply provides a convenient place to sit while it happens. Not all spaces prefer the same rhythm. A little way from this grain, there is a pore that filled with water and kept it. In that tiny still pond, oxygen has a harder time arriving, and another suite of microbes takes up the task of making do. They use other molecules as gentle stand-ins, rearranging nitrogen in different ways. It is not a battle. It is a series of rooms in a large, quiet house, each room with its own lamplight and its own soft conversation. The soil grain sits at the boundary between these rooms, sometimes within one, sometimes another, depending on the day, the weather, the texture of water and air. Imagine running your fingers, in thought, over a crumb of soil. You feel the binding of fungal hyphae like threads woven into a loose cloth. You sense the sticky touches of bacterial biofilms, a satin slip that holds and releases with grace. You feel tiny pebbles, silt and clay, integrated but not fused, each free to respond a little differently to wetting and drying. Within the crumb, your grain is nestled like a stone in a fruit cake. When the soil wets, the crumb swells slightly as water inhabits the spaces between clay sheets. When it dries, it relaxes and eases smaller trails open. The cycle repeats many times gently with the day's rising and falling humidity, and the grain goes along a respectful participant. Think for a moment about the grain's surface, if it happens to be a clay. Clays are like books with very thin pages. Between those pages, there are resting places for ions. Some ions are small and fit easily. Others are larger and may rest at the page edges. Sodium, calcium, potassium, ammonium, each has its own way of fitting in. The soil's pH, a reflection of how many protons drift in the water, can suggest to the grain which ions to welcome easily and which to hold more firmly. This is not a strict policy. It is a gentle preference. When a plant root sits near the grain, It often releases protons at the root tip, a quiet way of saying that it would like to exchange some ions. The grain obliges, passing a nutrient toward the root and receiving a proton, an elegant, silent swap. Over the course of a day, there are many of these small exchanges, and they add to the casual, ongoing economy that keeps the plant steady and green. Around noon, the upper soil warms. The heat is never harsh down here, only a sense of ease, of blankets being warmed by the sun in an adjacent room. Evaporation increases, sending a patient stream of water upward. Lower pores give up their water content a little at a time to feed the needs above. The tension in the water film grows, becoming slightly more intense, as if the minutiae were tightening a belt. Still, there is no rush. The changes are measured. The soil grain, especially if it is part of a fine textured soil, might be surrounded by many small pores that release water reluctantly, keeping it even when the day is warm, offering stability to the plant and to the countless small residents. Coarser grains, if this grain is sandy, are different. They let go more easily, and the water slips away, leaving familiar dryness and airy openness. Both sand and clay are important, and most soils are a mix, with silt in between, making a body that is neither too firm nor too loose, both cushion and raft. One layer above, perhaps just beyond your imagined footsteps, is the rhizosphere, the neighborhood right next to a root. It is an active place with gentle manners. Sugars, organic acids, amino acids, and small signals wash into this zone, creating a palette that guides microbes and influences mineral surfaces. The grain feels this influence when it is near. The root hair's cell wall is full of pectins and cellulose and proteins that make for a surface that fits comfortably against mineral faces. The mucilage fills the gaps, making the contact more intimate. In this closeness, the exchange of ions and the movement of water become more predictable. The grain provides a stable platform for that film of life, a lodge where the events of growth and nutrition mingle quietly. If you trace the route of a single water molecule beginning near the grain in the rhizosphere, you might imagine it slipping along the water film, passing by a resting microbe, then moving into the apoplast of the root, the spaces between cells gently guided by osmotic gradients. Later, in the morning's drift, that molecule may join a column moving upward, drawn by the cohesion of water and the pull of evaporation from leaves, a long elevator ride that does not feel like motion at this scale. The grain, meanwhile, stays put, observing in its way the faint changes this draw creates. The conversations of nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium shift slightly, like talk that changes topic while remaining soft. Not all parts of the day are about movement. Many minutes are simply time. In those moments, the grain surface gleams, if you could see it, with a sheen of moisture and a dusting of fine life. A bit of humic substance, dark and aromatic, drapes across a ledge. Nearby, a tiny spore waits. A font salt crystal, too small to sparkle, shares the corner. Particles of soot from fires long ago and specks brought by wind from far-off fields or deserts all settle here eventually. Soils are museums as much as gardens, collecting tiny artifacts that tells stories of the broader landscape, the climate, the plants and animals who visit it. The grain is not a curator. It is simply a shelf that holds these keepsakes easily. The afternoon passes with the slow changes that soils know. With every degree of temperature's rise or fall, a little expansion or contraction touches the particle and its neighbors, a tender flexion that rearranges how pores talk to one another. When moisture drops below a certain threshold, some microbes enter a resting state, drawing in their figurative edges like blankets to wait for the next beverage. Others, in protected films or gelled clusters, continue at a reduced speed. The grain offers stable footing for both. In small and larger aggregates, you find microhabitats. Areas inside aggregates can keep moisture longer, keep oxygen low, and protect organic matter from hurried breakdown. This is why aggregates help soils retain their healthy body. The grain is part of a crumb that has such an interior, and in there the day dims a little sooner, like a tucked away nook in a house that receives less light. You might picture, somewhere not too far, a stone larger than you, with a smooth underside slick from a thin trickle of water. A slug glides in slow contentment, touching organics and leaving a shining path till it adheres to its underside in grains and specks. When it passes, some particles are carried and then gently dropped elsewhere. The soil grain can be lifted and moved by such small agents, though not often and not far. More often, the grain is disturbed by the faint stirring of a root, pushing aside a fraction of a hair's breadth as it grows. Roots exert a minuscule pressure, and yet over a day they explore with a steady courtesy that changes the geometry of the pores, and thus the flow of water and air and the placement of life. A quiet train of thoughts can carry you deeper, down to where groundwater might be. The grain you are visiting could be near the surface or many hands deep. Near the surface, the temperature swings a bit more, and the water comes and goes. Deeper down, conditions are more stable, cooler, wetter, a place where decomposition leans toward slower, steadier steps, and where the iron may prefer to be slightly reduced, giving the soil subtle bluish or gray tones. Up here, in the day we are sharing, the grain simply skims off the benefits of a light dew and a brief rain. It does not ask for more. The afternoon reaches a calm plateau. Leaves above are open, their stomata breathing gently to maintain the day's flow. If a breeze moves the grass, the pattern of shadows shifts at the soil's surface, and the patches of slightly warmer or slightly cooler microclimate shift as well, knitting a very fine mosaic. The soil grain is a single tile in that mosaic. On its surface, if you could linger with a microscope that breathes as softly as this narration, you would see that the microbial biofilm is not a uniform coat. It is a cityscape with towers and low streets, with channels that let water slip between the buildings, with a horizon that rises and falls over a distance you could cross with a slow breath. Within that cityscape, species cluster, each in zones that suit them, and the chemical gradients are as gentle as drifting clouds of perfume. Everything feels balanced and considered, even though it grew without plan. When it is the right season, tiny roots will part ways as they age, leaving behind a lit tunnel called a macropore. Those macropores are like narrow caves, corridors that allow water to bypass the smaller spaces and move downward more quickly during rains. This can be helpful, so the soil does not saturate too quickly. It also means that some nutrients, if they exist in more mobile forms, can be carried deeper. The grain, given its position, occasionally witnesses a pulse of such water slide by, a clean ribbon within which only the tiniest particles travel. But for the most part, water moves by unspectacular percolation, comforting in its predictability. Take a moment here at this gentle midpoint of our day to notice how your breath has settled and how your body feels heavier against the bed or chair. If you're still with me, you can softly share your state in the comments. How sleepy are you on a scale of 1 to 10? Embrace the steady quiet again. In the later afternoon, small shadows begin to lengthen in the pore spaces. The temperature ceases its upward drift and finds a quiet ledge to rest upon before returning downward. The grain senses this change as a relaxation in the tensions that have been visiting its edges. Water still flows and evaporates, but more slowly. Slowly is the soil's favorite speed. In the pause, the bacteria that were busy nitrifying earlier may ease their pace. The fungi continue to slowly thread through last year's leaves, releasing sugars and organic acids in patterns that make sense to them, returning elements to circulation without demanding attention. You find yourself comfortable with how little needs to be controlled down here. The soil's choreography does not require an audience. It simply unfolds because the conditions invite it. Consider the stories of origin embedded within the grain. If it is quartz, it might have been born in the cooling of silica-rich magma in a place where crystals had time to grow. It weathered from a granite, perhaps, and was freed by fractures and carried by streams that softened its corners. If it is feldspar, it might be in the midst of its long arc toward clay, surrendering ions to water in exchange for a more layered form. If it is a clay, it might have built itself from dissolved pieces that reassembled, flake upon flake, like fallen leaves. The grain carries in its structure the memory of temperature and pressure conditions long past. But in the day we are sharing, those memories are simply quiet inhabitants, as unobtrusive as the spine of a book in a dark library. The soil around you is a blend of textures. Sand grains, if present, are like tiny marbles that keep space open. Silt grains are smaller and smoother, giving a soft body to the mix. Clay particles bind things together, retaining water and nutrients, and are content to provide a surface for endless, small dialogues. Organic matter adds softness and color, deepening the tone of the soil and increasing its ability to hold water like a sponge that does not notice its own weight. The structure of this mixture, a granular form in well-kept garden soil, a blocky form in some clays, a platy form in compacted layers, affects how the day's water and air and life arrange themselves. The grain takes its place in whichever structure forms, filling a role that is always modest and always essential. There are subtle visitors here too, tiny crystals of calcium, carbonate growing in dry regions, like little white stars, can be found in some soils. Specks of gypsum might settle after seasons of irrigation, small oxides of iron and manganese festoon pore walls with gentle color, yellow and red and brown and black, each an expression of oxidation state and time spent with water. These oxides can coat the grain, altering its surface properties and providing new seats for ions or new points for biofilm attachment. If you run your mind over these coats, they feel like extraordinarily fine velvet, a softness that catches nothing and yet holds everything lightly. As evening approaches, the air up above cools a little. The soil surface senses a change in the balance between incoming and outgoing heat. Cooling at the surface invites condensation in the small air spaces. Water vapor, which has been breathing slowly all day, finds surfaces and settles in tiny beads again. The grain receives a fresh gloss, a renewed film that smooths its irregularities like a fine polish. The smell, though faint and only imagined, becomes slightly richer, as if the day's flavors were steeping. Root hairs continue their quiet work, but the demand for water lessens, and the tension in the films eases. The hyphae do not stop. Their patience is timeless. Microbes enjoy the renewed moisture, which awakens those that had been dozing through the drier hours. And for a while, the tiny city on the grain brightens with activity that is gentle and content. Night does not fall in one layer below the surface. It pools softly, collecting first in upper spaces, then sending its chill down in waves of minutes. Sounds from above, winds subsiding, small animals finding their burrows, fade into a kind of audible pause. In the soil, night is a return to a steady setting. The temperature becomes kinder to certain enzymes that prefer cool. Oxygen use can slow slightly, and the gradients sharpen and then soften again as water and air redistribute themselves over micro distances. If there are segments of the soil that remain wetter for longer, those segments host communities that prosper now, rearranging nitrogen or living from the carbon that was sequestered within aggregates. The grain remains as calm as ever, a platform and shelter and surface. In winter, if this day had been in winter, freezing could occur. Water would arrange itself into crystals that unfold like elegant, slow-moving fans. As they form, they gently push grains aside, creating fine fissures that will later ease water flow and root exploration. When thaw comes, water returns to shake hands with the mineral surfaces again, and the cycle improves structure. The freeze and thaw, the wet and dry, are part of the soil's way of breathing over seasons. In the summer, drying may be stronger, and cracks in clayey soils will widen like smiles that reach their edges. In those woody cracks, insects explore, roots later travel, and the next rains penetrate deeply. The grain navigates each season by doing very little. Stillness is its whole art. Occasionally, a stronger storm comes, and surface water accelerates. The uppermost particles might be disturbed, rolled, or lifted, but many remain sheltered by the texture of plant cover and the cohesion of aggregates. If the grain happens to be at the surface, it might be nudged a small distance, only to settle again in a new neighborhood where the familiar routines resume. Over years and centuries, these small moves can change a grain's address from a hill crest to a hollow, from a garden to a stream bank, and eventually, perhaps, to a riverbed or floodplain. For our day, in our calm story, the grain rests in place, and the storm that might be never intrudes. Today is a day of moderation. In some soils, especially those touched by salt spray or irrigated with water containing dissolved salts, there are zones where salts accumulate. When the day's warmth draws water upward, the salts travel with it, then stop when the water evaporates, forming subtle rings. If the grain lives in such a place, small crystals may bloom on its face and then dissolve again when the next watering comes. This is the soil's version of tides, but they move invisibly, taste carried by the quiet parts of the day. In other soils, like those in forested uplands, acids from decaying pine needles and oak leaves wash through, encouraging the movement of iron and aluminum and the leaching of bases. The grain wears that as a slight change in color or a whisper in its surface charge, an adjustment so mild you would not notice the moment it happened. When you consider the many lives that touch the grain, microbial, plant, fungal, small invertebrate, it is soothing to realize how rarely conflict defines the scene down here. The tone is cooperation born from proximity and from the inherent generosity of decay, of the way that yesterday's growth becomes tomorrow's resource. Even predation, which exists as a part of ecology, is muted in this view, softened by the scale and the pace, more a trade than a struggle. Nutrients are returned to forms that can travel, and energy passes from form to form, each change adorned with quietness. Roots release exudates that keep neighbors close and content. Hyphae transport nutrients across small dry gaps, gifting pieces of phosphate or nitrogen in exchange for carbon. Bacteria fix nitrogen when and where the oxygen level is just right in symbiosis with the plant. Worms, with their gentle motions, mix the layers and cast tidy pellets that improve structure. The sum of these acts is a soil that cradles the day's warmth in the right measure and stores water for when it is needed. The grain contributes surface area, a treasure in itself. A handful of soil contains enough surface area in its fine particles to host entire cities upon cities, each bursting with minute life. Yet it does not look like much. It looks like dirt, a word that sometimes needs a kinder reintroduction. When we say soil, we quietly respect the community you are visiting now. Tread your thoughts toward the chemistry of iron for a moment. Iron's colors give soil its glow. In well-aerated soils, iron is content oxidized, lending reds and browns to the particles. In wetter soils, iron spends time in reduced forms, grays and blues that bleed into the matrix, sometimes forming mottles where conditions shift with the seasons, like little watercolor blooms on a stone canvas. When the day is dry, iron sits quietly in oxides on the grain, a coat that changes how water interacts and how certain molecules, such as phosphate, attach. This affects how easy it is for a root to claim them. The grain's iron coat is a helpful friend that can sometimes hold on to a nutrient a little too fondly. In the gentle intimacy of a root's rhizosphere, that hold often relaxes as organic acids coax release with a tender hand. We can visit carbon for a while. There is fresh, bright carbon in the soil, in sugars and bits of plant residue. There is older, darker carbon, more complex, part of humus, a stew of large molecules with rings and branches that create spongy spaces. Some of this carbon sticks to mineral surfaces, like our grain, forming associations that keep it from being quickly broken down. This mineral-associated organic carbon is a quiet bank, storing pieces of the atmosphere's breath for years and sometimes centuries. It is held by the same friendly attractions that bind water and ions, not locked, but gently restrained from a hurried departure. The grain's ability to hold such carbon depends on its mineralogy and on the nature of the organic molecules, and on time, always time. On the scale of days, these processes are like an evening's mending. On the scale of years, they are like the weaving of a tapestry that drapes across landscapes. As the night deepens, the soil grows slightly cooler and subtly quieter yet. Nighttime dew near the surface gives a freshened look to everything, and below, the moisture reaches an equilibrium that is soothing to the bodies that rest here. The bacterial films, those thin veneers of life on the grains, relax into their baseline cycles. The fungal threads measure their environment and grow a short distance onward, then pause, as if making an internal note. Small animals become less present, or else become nocturnal spirits that pass in such a way that only their effects are felt. Tiny burrows extended, new droppings that will become part of tomorrow's chemistry, a root nipped here or there in a manner that does not even register as a disturbance at this generous scale. If you glance at the grain with the eye of geology, it is not truly fragile. Imagine it under the tread of time. Wind brings dust that brushes its face. Water invites ions out and leaves others behind. Freezing invites expansion and then allows relaxation. The grain changes softly, rounding here, etching there, perhaps acquiring a new coat of oxides or organic matter, perhaps losing a corner to a slight dissolution. In human time, we see a handful of soil and call it stable. In the soil's time, it is a slow dance of forms that never loses composure. One day is a single measure in a long song, and the grain hums along, aware in its mineral way. Now and then, disturbances come that matter. A footstep above compresses the soil slightly, and the pore spaces rearrange. If the soil is moist, the footprint holds its shape. If the soil is dry, it yields less and the air remains in place. Compaction is a softness lost, and over time it can harden the atmosphere of this world. In this story, though, the footstep came softly and rarely, and the soil structure is good. There is, besides, the memory of the worm channels and root paths that keep the neighborhood open. Each day, these channels do their simple job of letting air and water reach where they are needed. The grain appreciates this, though it would never say so. Far below, in clays and silts that predate this day's season, there are layers of material that shrink and swell with moisture. These movements create slow mixing soil material moving upward and downward, a thing called cryoturbation in cold climates and other names elsewhere. Even without frost, such mixing can happen. Over a day, none of this matters in a way that you can feel. But when you think of 1,000 such days, it forms a lullaby of motion that the grain participates in without intention. Think, if you wish, about how soil stores memories of what grows above. A prairie's grasses leave a deep litter of roots, even in one season, constantly growing and shedding fine rootlets that become organic matter. A forest's leaf litter, broad leaves or needles, feeds fungal networks that tie aggregates into strings. A garden with its tilled rows and soft compost provides a buffet that encourages exuberant microbial growth, and the soil there is often a very welcoming body. Each of these ecosystems is like a flavor, and the grain becomes seasoned over time by the stew it simmers in. In a single day, you taste only a sip. It is enough. Evening deepens toward night. If the day brought a light rain earlier, now the slow percolation of that water continues downward. It moves around roots and along the faces of minerals. It enters cavities that were dry by afternoon and fills them like lamp oil being poured into lanterns. The water carries dissolved carbonates and silicic acid, and these may precipitate elsewhere, forming tiny nodules that someday will be discovered as small stones. The path the water takes is a complicated network of easier routes and small thresholds. Hydrophobic patches on organic coatings might temporarily resist the water until they are wetted. Then, like a sleepy eye opening, the patch accepts the moisture and the film spreads. The grain is occasionally at such a boundary, participating in the conversion from a drop perched above to a film that keeps its place. In some soils, close to the surface, cyanobacteria and algae may form a crust that binds particles and prevents wind from lifting them. This biological soil crust, if present, is a delicate web that holds sand grains in place and prevents erosion. If our grain is part of such a crust, the day's sunlight would have been more relevant, fueling a bit of photosynthesis that adds oxygen and organic carbon to the neighborhood. The night would bring closure of the tiny photochemical factories, rest, and dew that rehydrates the cells. Even in that scenario, the tone remains restful. The crust breathes and then rests, and the grain is both a beneficiary and a contributor. In agricultural soils, a day might include the arrival of dissolved fertilizer during irrigation. Nitrogen, in forms that travel easily, like nitrate, slips past quickly if the soil is sandy, or moves in step with water if it is finer. Potassium is held more tightly by clays, and phosphorus often slows, meeting mineral edges that welcome it as a guest who tends to stay longer. The grain interacts with this day's nutrients by offering its surface. When the crop's root tip arrives, secreting protons and organic acids, a bit of phosphate lifts away. Geometric elegance at a scale without sound. When a day later the soil dries slightly, those same places may again carry phosphorus. So the story alternates, offer and receive, supply and store, each day playing a tiny role in the harvest that months later will appear. If we talk of pathogens or plant stresses, we do so with gentleness. There are organisms that carry disease, and there are stresses like drought and salinity that challenge plants. In the soil, even those experiences are buffered by community, by the presence of other organisms that compete with or suppress illness, by the structure that retains water and allows roots to travel deeper, finding safety. The grain is a small piece of that buffer. It cannot cure, but it supports the meandering paths of remedies, letting air, water, and beneficial life find their way. As night reaches its quietest hours, a hush deeper than the evening's calm spreads in the pores. Temperatures usually reach their nightly low. The soil's heat flux, that slow exchange with the surface and the air above, comes to a pause, a balanced midpoint before morning. In your mind, sit still on the grained surface and look outward. The film of water is smooth, with occasional tiny humps where it meets a roughness. Bubbles of gas are absent, the exchange is too gentle for them to form. The biofilm is intact, so fine that it does not shine, only softening the surface like breath on glass. If a mineral has a subtle crystal face, the plane is almost lost to the gentle coat it wears. You feel the comfort of stability, as if you were in a room with thick walls, a room that remembers many nights and welcomes each new one the same way. The grain's day includes an awareness of gravity only as a constant direction. Everything slightly favors downward in wetting and drying, in percolation and capillarity. There is always a vector that suggests where things ought to settle. Over long times, this shapes profiles and patterns. Over a day, it is a backdrop. What matters more is the dance of potentials in water. Matrix potential in the small pores, osmotic potential in the solute presence, gravitational potential along the profile, pressure potential if the soil is saturated. Those potentials are like the set of instruments in an orchestra, each contributing a tone. The soil grain does not conduct the orchestra, but it provides a resonance chamber within which the music can be heard. Imagine curling up in a very small nook at the edge of the grain, a little alcove under a shelf. Here, water remains even when the broader pores dry, because the curvature is favorable. This tiny reserve can be a lifeline for a microbe or a germinating seed's earliest step, a pocket that holds on during a warm afternoon until evening brings relief. These microhabitats demonstrate how structure creates function, how the small shapes that the grain carries are not accidents, but tools that the world uses to keep life steady. Take in the rhythm of redox again. In many tiny points near the grain, electrons transfer as molecules accept and relinquish them. Oxygen accepts in aerobic spots. Nitrates accept where oxygen is less available. Iron and manganese step in elsewhere and in very reduced pockets. Even sulfate or carbon dioxide accepts. The sequence order depends on availability and energy yield, and it is not something you need to memorize tonight. It is enough to know that life has options, and the soil silently offers them. The grain's presence is a scaffold upon which these options rest. Smooth surfaces, rough surfaces, coatings, and all of these create places where an enzyme can sit and work, where a microbe can attach and feed, where a molecule can pause long enough for a reaction to reach a conclusion. Water chemistry finds room here too, with carbonic acid forming gently when carbon dioxide dissolves in water. That acid is not harsh. It is a soft solvent that whispers to calcium carbonate, dissolving a little and then moving along, only to later be used in making shells or bones or precipitating again, perhaps as a calcareous nodule. In the same way, silica dissolves a tiny amount, enough to contribute to the eventual formation of opal-like coatings, or to feed the steady creation of clay. The pace is not measurable in hours, usually, but 2 or 3 changes can begin over a day, the kind of beginnings that only reveal themselves when many days stand shoulder to shoulder. It is comforting to think of how soil supports the larger world, fields, forests, gardens, and the wild spaces between. A day in the life of a grain is a day in the life of a field of wheat or a grove of trees, just seen at a different magnification. Each breath the soil takes complements the breath the leaves take. Each soft reaction at the mineral surface supports a seedling's quiet growth. Even the stones and the smallest sand grains join in this, offering stability and pathways. In the smallest actions, the day finds its meaning. The first hint of pre-dawn begins again as the earth spins and the cycle of our shared day approaches its close. High above, the air brightens in a color that the soil does not see, but that you can imagine. The temperature lowers to its nightly low, and then begins imperceptibly to rise. The soil grain sighs in its way, a breath of the pores. Dew forms in small arcs along the edges of space. Roots ready themselves to draw again. Microbes that prefer light, if present near the very surface, sense the change and prepare to start their tiny factories. Others simply continue, indifferent to the presence of light, content with the steady, cloistered life below. The grain remains in the same space, part of the same aggregate, with the same patient surroundings. Nothing dramatic is expected. The continued comfort is the comfort. There will be days with big rain and days with none. There will be days with footfalls and days with birdsong and no one touching the ground. There will be seasons when the soil is covered and seasons when it is bare. The grain will accept each day with the same accommodation. Over a year, a root may grow past and then die back, and the space it held will become a little tunnel for air and water. Over 5 years, this grain may take on a slightly thicker iron coat. Over 50, it may join a different aggregate, be carried a short distance by an insect, or simply remain and gather a microforest of organic molecules. Over a century, it might begin to show small signs of rounding and become part of a horizon that is slightly different than it once was. All of these timescales nest inside one another like wooden dolls, and the day we shared is the smallest one you can hold comfortably in your palm. Before we say good night to the grain, you might imagine reaching out, not to change anything, but to acknowledge it. You can picture laying a finger on the surface of the soil and feeling through that touch an inheritance older than mountains and as immediate as your next breath. You might recognize that the quiet endurance of a soil grain is similar to the quiet endurance you carry. You persist through hours and days, sometimes noticed, often simply doing what needs doing, providing a surface for others to rest against, offering support. The soil grain offers you that metaphor like a warm cup in the evening. You do not need to drink deeply to be comforted. A sip is enough. The soil's day ends where it began, in an equilibrium that looks like stillness. The pore spaces hold a balanced mixture of air and water. The biofilms are dressed for night and settled in. The root hairs wait, some sleeping, some simply pausing, their membranes ready for the next exchange. The fungal hyphae touch several grains at once, their networks unbroken. The grain does not go anywhere. In going nowhere, it supports everything that does, The gentle rhythm continues, and it will continue as you rest. You can let your attention float up now, if you wish, from the pore to the broader soil, from the aggregate to the profile, from the profile to the field or forest that holds it, and then to your room, quiet and safe. Your bed, your chair, your blanket, your soft light are all here, waiting to cradle you as kindly as the soil cradles seeds. There is no hurry to return. You can stay with the grain in your mind as long as it feels pleasant, then drift back easily. If your eyes are already heavy, you can let them close and know that the world beneath you is doing its calm, patient work, a lullaby made of minerals and water, and a soft exchange of breath. Thank you for spending this quiet day with me. If this helped you relax, a like and a gentle subscribe help this little corner of calm keep going, and they let you find your way back whenever you want to drift with another story. You're safe, you are warm, and the earth below is steady. Rest well, and sleep comes as the gentle rhythm continues.